On February 28, 1986, the world was shocked by the tragic assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. At the time, Palme was a prominent figure on the global stage, known for his progressive policies and outspoken views. His murder sent shockwaves through Sweden and left an indelible mark on the country's political landscape. To truly understand the magnitude of this crime, it's essential to know who Olof Palme was and why his life and death matter, not just to Sweden, but to the world. Olof Palme was born in 1927 in Stockholm, Sweden. He became involved in politics at a young age, following in the footsteps of his parents, who were both politically active. He joined the Swedish Social Democratic Party and quickly rose through the ranks due to his intellectual abilities and charisma. Palme's political career took off in the 1960s when he became the Minister of Education, a role that gave him the platform to push for significant social reforms, including making education more accessible to all Swedes. By 1969, Palme had become Sweden's Prime Minister. Under his leadership, Sweden became known for its strong social welfare system, progressive tax policies, and an unwavering commitment to social equality. He was also a staunch advocate for human rights on the global stage, often speaking out against injustices wherever they occurred. Palme's foreign policy stance was notably critical of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, which earned him both admiration and hostility, particularly from Western leaders. His criticism of the Vietnam War, his vocal support for the rights of oppressed nations, and his global advocacy for peace set him apart from many other politicians of his time. Palme's popularity was not without its challenges. He faced significant opposition from conservative factions within Sweden, as well as from industrial leaders who felt threatened by his pro-labor policies. His outspoken nature and willingness to take on powerful institutions, both within Sweden and internationally, made him a controversial figure. Yet, despite the criticism, Palme remained a deeply respected and influential leader in Swedish politics. He was committed to the idea of Sweden as a fair and just society, and his vision was one of a peaceful, egalitarian nation that would provide for its citizens. In the 1980s, Palme's political career was marked by a sense of uncertainty. Sweden was facing economic challenges, and his government had to grapple with rising unemployment, inflation, and growing political discontent. Despite these challenges, Palme continued to advocate for policies that he believed would protect Sweden's social welfare system. However, these very policies were also being criticized by many Swedes, who felt that Palme's government was out of touch with the realities facing the average person. The growing divide between those who supported his policies and those who opposed them led to increasing political polarization within the country. On the night of February 28, 1986, Palme was returning home from a night out at the cinema with his wife, Lisbeth, in downtown Stockholm. The couple had attended a movie screening at a local theater, a rare outing for the Prime Minister. As they left the theater and were walking down the street, a man emerged from the shadows and shot Palme in cold blood. Lisbeth Palme, who was walking alongside her husband, was unharmed but witnessed the brutal attack. The assassin fled the scene immediately, disappearing into the night. The murder of Olof Palme was a shock to the Swedish people. It shattered the illusion of safety that many had felt living in a peaceful, crime-free society. Palme's death left a void in Swedish politics, and his loss was deeply felt by those who admired him as both a leader and a symbol of progressive values. His murder marked the beginning of an investigation that would span decades, and to this day, the question of who killed Olof Palme and why remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern history. In the aftermath of Olof Palme's tragic death, the investigation into his murder began almost immediately. The events that followed the assassination were chaotic, as Swedish authorities scrambled to understand what had happened and identify the killer. The murder of the Prime Minister shocked not only Sweden but also the international community. It seemed impossible that a leader of such prominence could be taken from the world so suddenly and violently, especially in the middle of a crowded street. As the police began their investigation, one of the biggest challenges was the lack of clear witnesses. While there were several people in the area at the time of the murder, few could provide useful descriptions of the shooter. The people who had been closest to Palme during the attack, including his wife Lisbeth, were in shock and had difficulty recalling specific details. This left investigators with limited information to work with as they attempted to piece together the puzzle of Palme's assassination. At the scene, the police found very little evidence. There were no fingerprints or other identifying marks left by the killer, and the few shell casings recovered from the scene were not enough to provide a clear lead. Without any substantial forensic evidence, the investigation became even more difficult. The authorities were left to rely on witness statements, which were often conflicting and lacked the necessary details to identify the perpetrator. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the murder was not a random act of violence. The calculated manner in which the assassination had been carried out suggested that there was a deeper motive behind the crime. Palme was no ordinary politician. He had made numerous enemies over the course of his career, both in Sweden and internationally. The theory that Palme's assassination was politically motivated gained traction early on. Some believed that his death was the result of a conspiracy orchestrated by those who opposed his political views. Palme had made enemies both within Sweden and abroad, particularly among conservative factions and foreign governments that disagreed with his progressive policies. As the investigation progressed, several possible leads were pursued, but none resulted in solid evidence. One of the first suspects in the case was a man named Christer Peterson. Peterson had a history of violence and was arrested after a witness, Lisbeth Palme, identified him in a police lineup. However, in a dramatic turn of events, Peterson was acquitted during his trial due to insufficient evidence. The investigation then entered a difficult phase, as the authorities struggled to find new leads or reliable witnesses. While the media continued to report on the case and new theories emerged, the investigation seemed to stall. Each new suspect appeared to be another dead end, and with each passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to diminish. Despite the continued efforts of law enforcement, the murder of Olof Palme remained a haunting mystery that lingered in the minds of the public. As the investigation into the murder of Olof Palme continued, the authorities faced mounting pressure to find answers. The Swedish public, still in shock from the assassination of their prime minister, eagerly awaited any new developments. However, despite the efforts of the police, the case seemed to grow more complicated with each passing year. The lack of concrete evidence and reliable witnesses made the investigation feel like an impossible puzzle, with few leads to follow and no clear suspects. One of the early suspects that came into focus was Christer Peterson, a man with a criminal history. Peterson was arrested after Lisbeth Palme, the Prime Minister's wife, identified him in a police lineup. The fact that Lisbeth had witnessed the murder gave her testimony significant weight. However, when Peterson was put on trial for the murder, the case took an unexpected turn. Despite the identification, there was not enough evidence to secure a conviction, and Peterson was acquitted. The acquittal shocked the Swedish public and raised serious doubts about the police investigation. The case then entered a period of stagnation. For several years, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. New leads would surface, only to fizzle out without any substantial progress. The lack of hard evidence and the difficulty in finding reliable witnesses left investigators with few options. Public interest in the case remained high, but with each passing year, the chances of solving the mystery seemed to diminish. As time went on, the murder of Olof Palme became one of Sweden's most famous cold. Throughout the investigation, many theories were proposed about the motive behind Palme's assassination. Some believed that his murder was the result of a personal vendetta, perhaps from an individual who had a deep-seated grievance against him. Others, however, argued that the murder was politically motivated. Palme's outspoken criticism of the United States, particularly during the Vietnam War, had earned him many enemies both within Sweden and abroad. His progressive policies and vocal stance on the political motivation theory gained significant traction as time went on. Palme's foreign policy, particularly his opposition to the United States and his advocacy for global issues like apartheid in South Africa, made him a target for various groups. Some speculated that Palme's murder was carried out by foreign intelligence agencies or political adversaries who viewed his actions as a threat to their own interests. One of the major challenges facing the investigation was the lack of forensic evidence. Despite the fact that the murder took place in a public space, there were no fingerprints, no weapon, and no clear traces left by the assassin. This made it incredibly difficult for the police to piece together the details of the crime. Without concrete physical evidence, the investigation had to rely on witness testimonies and circumstantial evidence, but even these were inconsistent and often contradictory. Over time, the investigation became a symbol of frustration for both the authorities and the Swedish public. It seemed as though every lead that was pursued ended in a dead end. Even as new suspects were brought into the spotlight, no one was able to provide definitive answers about who was responsible for Palme's death. Theories continued to proliferate, but the investigation remained stuck in a state of uncertainty, with no clear resolution in sight. In the years following Olof Palme's assassination, the investigation into his murder was periodically revived with new efforts to identify the killer. Despite the attention that the case garnered, there was no breakthrough for many years. One of the biggest hurdles in the investigation was the lack of solid evidence. There were no concrete clues at the crime scene, and despite numerous suspects, no one seemed to have a clear motive for the murder. Over time, the theory that Palme's assassination was politically motivated gained more attention. Given his strong stances on global issues, such as the Vietnam War and apartheid, some believed that his death was orchestrated by political opponents who saw him as a threat to their interests. The notion of foreign involvement was also raised during the investigation. Palme's vocal criticism of the United States, particularly during the Cold War era, had made him enemies in powerful circles. Some theorized that his assassination was carried out by foreign intelligence agencies, possibly even the CIA, as a response to his political beliefs. However, no hard evidence ever emerged to substantiate this theory, leaving it more speculative than factual. As the years passed, the investigation became somewhat of a cold case. New theories and suspects surfaced periodically, but none of these led to any concrete results. In 1989, a man named Christer Peterson was arrested and later convicted based on witness testimony. However, his conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeal in 1990 due to lack of sufficient evidence. The authorities were left with no new suspects, and the investigation seemed to stall once again. Despite the many challenges, the investigation never officially closed. The murder of Olof Palme remained an open case, and new attempts to solve it were made periodically. In the early 2000s, the Swedish authorities reopened the case with a renewed focus on previously overlooked evidence. This renewed effort reignited hope that answers might finally be found, but the case remained unsolved. In 2020, the Swedish authorities made an announcement that stunned the public. After a lengthy review of the evidence, investigators had concluded that Stig Engström, a graphic designer who had been at the scene of the crime, was the most likely suspect. Engström had been present near the crime scene and had exhibited suspicious behavior in the days following the murder. The revelation that Stig Engström was the prime suspect brought some closure to the case, but it also sparked debate. Some believed that Engström was indeed the killer, while others felt that the investigation had been rushed and that there were still unresolved aspects of the case. The fact that Engström had passed away in 2000, long before the authorities officially concluded the investigation, meant that justice would never be fully served. For many, this left a sense of incompleteness in the case. As the investigation into Olof Palme's murder continued, more questions arose than answers. The case had taken on a life of its own, drawing in a wide array of theories, speculations, and even conspiracy theories. Despite the authorities' best efforts, the key question, who killed Olof Palme and why, remained unresolved for decades. The murder of such a prominent political figure was a puzzle that even the best investigators couldn't seem to solve, leaving the public both fascinated and frustrated. The theory that Stig Engström was responsible for Palme's murder gained significant attention after the Swedish authorities named him as the prime suspect in 2020. Engström had been present at the scene of the murder and had exhibited strange behavior in the aftermath. His presence near the crime scene, along with his inconsistent statements, led authorities to conclude that he was the most likely perpetrator. One of the main criticisms of the investigation was the lack of hard evidence linking Engström to the crime. There were no clear fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no physical evidence that could definitively prove his guilt. The authorities relied on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, but these were often unreliable. The fact that Engström had passed away in 2000 before the investigation officially concluded only added to the sense of frustration. The political motivation theory continued to loom large throughout the investigation. Palme's foreign policy, particularly his opposition to the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War and his support for the anti-apartheid movement, made him a polarizing figure. It was widely believed that Palme's outspoken views had earned him numerous enemies, both domestically and internationally. Despite these theories, there was still no concrete evidence to support the claim that Palme's murder was politically motivated. In the years following the assassination, several high-profile suspects were examined, but none of them led to definitive proof. The lack of clarity regarding the motive for Palme's murder made it difficult for investigators to get any closer to solving the case. As time went on, the public's interest in the case seemed to wane. However, the idea that Olof Palme's murder was connected to a larger political conspiracy continued to fuel discussions in Sweden and abroad. The unresolved nature of the case, combined with the lack of concrete evidence, ensured that the murder remained one of the most talked about and discussed crimes in modern history. Despite the official conclusion of the investigation in 2020, naming Stig Engström as the prime suspect in the murder of Olof Palme, the case continued to haunt both the Swedish public and the international community. The political nature of Palme's murder remained a central theme throughout the investigation. Palme was no ordinary politician. His progressive views on social justice, his outspoken criticism of the United States, and his strong support for international causes like anti-apartheid made him a target for both domestic and foreign adversaries. Despite Engström's identification as the most likely perpetrator, there were many who believed that the case was not entirely resolved. Engström had been present at the scene of the murder and had exhibited suspicious behavior afterward, but no direct evidence linked him to the crime. His death in 2000 meant that he would never stand trial for the crime, leaving the case without a definitive resolution. The lack of a clear motive for Engström's actions only fueled speculation. Without a concrete reason for why he would have wanted to kill Palme, many remained unconvinced by the authorities' conclusion. Some believed that Engström's behavior in the aftermath of the murder was an indication of his guilt, while others pointed out that his strange actions might have been a result of psychological issues or even a personal vendetta unrelated to the political implications of the murder. One of the most enduring theories surrounding Palme's assassination was that it was politically motivated. Palme's views on global issues, particularly his criticism of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War and his outspoken opposition to apartheid, had earned him many enemies. Some believed that Palme's death was the result of a political conspiracy involving foreign governments, intelligence agencies, or powerful political factions who saw him as a threat to their interests. The idea that foreign intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, might have been involved in Palme's assassination gained traction in certain circles. Given Palme's vocal opposition to U.S. foreign policy, it was not difficult to imagine that the American government might have seen him as a liability. However, despite extensive investigation, no direct evidence was ever uncovered to support this theory. Even as the case officially closed, questions about the investigation itself persisted. Critics of the authorities' handling of the case pointed out that the investigation had been plagued by missteps and missed opportunities. The long period of uncertainty, combined with the lack of solid evidence, led many to question whether the authorities had truly done everything in their power to uncover the truth. Despite the official closure of the case in 2020, naming Stig Engström as the prime suspect in the murder of Olof Palme, the unresolved nature of the case continued to capture the public's imagination. The questions surrounding Palme's death, and the theories about who may have been responsible, remained a source of ongoing speculation. While some believed that the case had been solved, many others felt that the full truth had never been uncovered. The idea that Olof Palme's assassination was politically motivated continued to be one of the most widely discussed theories. Palme's views on foreign policy and his outspoken criticism of the United States had earned him many enemies both at home and abroad. His support for progressive movements and his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War made him a polarizing figure, and some believed that these political stances could have led to his murder. Even after Engström's identification as the prime suspect, many still questioned whether he had acted alone. Some theorists believed that Engström's actions might have been part of a larger conspiracy, perhaps involving political forces both within Sweden and beyond its borders. Given the political context of Palme's assassination, it was not difficult to imagine that other players might have been involved in orchestrating the crime. The lack of solid evidence linking Engström directly to the murder only added to the uncertainty surrounding the case. While his presence at the scene and his odd behavior afterward were considered suspicious, there was no definitive proof that he had committed the murder. Engström's death in 2000 meant that he would never face trial for the crime, and this left many questions unanswered. Some critics of the investigation argued that the authorities had prematurely closed the case without fully concide. The theory that the murder was politically motivated, possibly the work of foreign intelligence agencies, continued to gain traction among some. The idea that Palme's death was the result of a conspiracy involving powerful political forces or covert government operations seemed plausible to many. Palme's outspoken criticism of the U.S. government and his involvement in international causes had made him a target for certain groups who viewed him as a threat. The official conclusion that Engström was the likely perpetrator was based on a review of the evidence, but many people still felt that the investigation had not gone far enough. The complexity of the case, combined with the political ramifications, made it difficult to draw clear conclusions. Despite the closure of the case, the lingering doubts about the investigation's thoroughness and the lack of a definitive trial continued to fuel speculation. The murder of Olof Palme, one of Sweden's most high-profile political figures, continued to be a topic of great interest even after the official closure of the case. While the authorities had named Stig Engström as the likely perpetrator, the unresolved nature of the case kept the public questioning whether the true killer had ever been brought to justice. As time went on, the theory that Olof Palme's assassination was politically motivated gained more and more attention. Palme had made powerful enemies over the years due to his vocal criticism of the United States, his involvement in global movements for peace, and his strong stance against apartheid in South Africa. The idea that Palme's murder was part of a larger political plot became a prominent theory throughout the investigation. Some believed that foreign intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, might have been involved, given Palme's outspoken opposition to the Vietnam War and his criticism of U.S. foreign policy. However, despite the many theories surrounding the case, the Swedish authorities concluded that Stig Engström was the most likely suspect. Engström had been at the scene of the murder, and his behavior in the days following the assassination raised suspicions. He had inconsistencies in his statements, and there were several oddities in his actions that led investigators to believe he might have been involved. One of the central criticisms of the investigation was the lack of concrete evidence linking Engström to the murder. While investigators were able to trace his movements and behavior following the assassination, there was no definitive proof that he had fired the fatal shots. The political nature of Palme's assassination continued to be a key factor in the ongoing debate about the case. Some theorized that Palme's death was the result of foreign interference, while others pointed to domestic political rivalries as the driving force behind the murder. The mystery surrounding Olof Palme's murder has continued to captivate both the Swedish public and the world. Even after the Swedish authorities officially closed the case in 2020, naming Stig Engström as the prime suspect, the unresolved questions still linger. Despite the identification of Engström as the most likely perpetrator, many people remain unconvinced. The lack of definitive proof and the absence of a trial left a sense of incompleteness. One of the major points of contention in the case is the political context surrounding the murder. Olof Palme was a deeply polarizing figure, both within Sweden and internationally. His stances on global issues, such as the Vietnam War and apartheid, made him a target for various groups and individuals who saw him as a threat. The idea that Palme's assassination was the result of a political conspiracy has been a central theory in the case from the beginning. Many have suggested that the murder was carried out by foreign intelligence agencies or domestic political rivals. Palme's vocal criticism of the United States, particularly during the Vietnam War, made him unpopular with certain political factions, both in Sweden and abroad. Despite the compelling nature of these theories, no concrete evidence ever emerged to support the idea that Palme's murder was the result of a political plot. The authorities explored these theories, but the investigation was unable to produce the kind of proof that would have validated them. The Swedish authorities' decision to focus on Stig Engström as the prime suspect has been met with mixed reactions. Engström had been at the scene of the murder, and his behavior in the days following the assassination raised suspicions. He had exhibited strange actions and inconsistencies in his statements, which led investigators to believe he was involved in the crime. Despite the lack of solid evidence linking Engström to the murder, the authorities were convinced that he was the most likely suspect. This conclusion was based on a review of the evidence, including witness testimonies and circumstantial evidence. However, many people still felt that the case had not been fully resolved. The absence of a definitive trial and the lack of a clear motive for Engström's actions left many feeling that the true story behind Palme's death remained hidden. The conclusion of the Olof Palme case in 2020, which named Stig Engström as the most likely suspect, did little to quiet the ongoing speculation about the true circumstances of his murder. The case, which had captivated the Swedish public for over 3 decades, remained a source of controversy. For many, the idea that the case had been closed without a definitive trial felt like an injustice. Stig Engström, who was identified as the prime suspect, had died in 2000, meaning that he would never face trial for the murder. This fact created a sense of unease, as it meant that there would never be a formal legal process to determine whether Engström was indeed guilty. The lack of a clear motive for Engström's actions also left many people questioning whether the authorities had fully understood the reasons behind the murder. While Engström's strange behavior and inconsistencies in his statements after the crime made him a suspect, there was no clear explanation as to why he would have killed Palme. The political nature of Palme's assassination remained central to the investigation, even after the case was officially closed. Palme had made powerful enemies during his time in office, both in Sweden and abroad. His vocal criticism of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, as well as his outspoken stance on apartheid, had earned him the ire of many. Despite the many theories that circulated during the investigation, the authorities were unable to definitively prove that Palme's murder was politically motivated. The idea of a conspiracy, involving foreign intelligence agencies or domestic political rivals, was never substantiated. While the theory gained traction among some, it remained speculative, as there was no hard evidence to support it. The theory that Engström was the lone perpetrator of the crime remained the most plausible explanation, according to the Swedish authorities. However, the absence of concrete evidence linking him to the crime and the fact that he could never face trial left the case open to continued speculation.